The content discussed in this episode may be specific to the guest's organisation or location and may not be applicable to other organisations, states, territories or countries. The material presented in this podcast is for general information purposes only and should not be considered health, legal or financial advice. Medical administration is a rewarding profession, but it comes with challenges. So what is it like, and what should you do if confronted with a monumental administrative difficulty? This is the podcast that takes unfortunate scenarios and explores the essentials of clinical governance to find solutions. I'm Dr David Rankin, a very experienced medical administrator and lead fellow with the Royal Australasian College of Medical Administrators. And this is Safeguarding Healthcare, the essentials of clinical governance. Today, moving a mountain.
This indicates that clinical quality hasn't actually permeated through the organisation.
That's Brigadier Dr Darrell Duncan, a highly experienced medical administrator who is currently responsible for reviewing the standards of care provided to members of the Australian Defence Force. And I'm presenting him with a difficult scenario.
Clinical complaints can certainly give you some ideas, but remember they're often the tip of the iceberg.
In this episode, Dr Duncan will discuss what to do when hospital audits fail to result in improved practice. In this scenario, a hospital is undertaking dozens of audits across most clinical areas, but concerns are being raised that all of this work by your quality improvement team just isn't resulting in improved patient outcomes. Many of the audits generate suggestions for improvement, but there is no register of recommendations or apparent process to follow through. Several senior managers have complained that most recommendations are impractical, given low levels of staffing and high costs. And, when changes are made, they are assigned to individuals who sometimes leave or change roles. So there's a real failure of quality improvement. I started by asking Darrell what sort of concerns this scenario raises.
I think, David, this indicates that clinical quality hasn't actually permeated through the organisation. So they know they've got to do bits and pieces. They're probably doing compliance audits to make sure they're following policy. They're doing things perhaps right, but they don't follow through and they don't do true quality audits that lead to quality improvement. What I often find the root cause of that lack of follow-through is, in fact, that staff don't know what to do. So they do the audit, they know that there's something wrong. They very often come up with recommendations about policy and training, which are low-quality recommendations, but they don't have an understanding of how to go about a clinical improvement project that would fix that audit. The other issue I find is people over-audit. So auditing for auditing's sake might be good in one sense, but you've got to target your audits to find out what's going to be good for your organisation, what's going to give you bang for your buck, and to identify your risks so that you can then address the high-risk areas.
Let's start with that. How do you identify risk? How do you know what it is that the hospital's doing that's generating adverse events or poor outcomes?
There's a range of ways you can look at this, and it's almost like having an array of sensors out there to try and pick up information and signals to say something's going wrong. Obvious areas are the clinical incident systems and the clinical complaints or complaints about healthcare. They can certainly give you some ideas, but remember they're often the tip of the iceberg and people often don't look at them very hard. If it's a complaint, they make sure they respond to the complainant and don't think further into the system or into the problems. And with a clinical incident, they often don't think of the systems issues that are associated with that incident. They just try and address the incident and move on. So I think by analysing the reports from those systems, you may well find out. Even better, and a much more sensitive source, is to talk to your staff as long as you've got a good relationship with them and they don't think you're coming down to judge them or be pejorative, they will open up and tell you where they think the risks are, and they will tell you what worries them. A good way I've seen put it is to tell me about the 3 things that keep you awake at night when you go home and what worries you each day. And there are ways you can get ideas to bring it up. If you wait until a disaster happens, and obviously you've missed the boat, but it's really a case of having that radar approach and taking in information from lots of sources to try and identify where the risk is.
One of the issues the scenario raises, I guess, is that big question of culture. Everybody's duck shoving, saying, not me, I'm doing it fine, but it's the other crowd. And I guess culture comes from leadership.
Yeah.
Can you comment on the role of culture and how you can change that culture?
You're quite correct. The link between culture and leadership is strong. And if leadership in many organisations may well talk big but don't actually act in the same approach. So they may say that they want a no-blame culture, they don't want to look for scapegoats, they want to find systems issues. But if something goes wrong, then they then take administrative action against someone because they think they're at fault. And that creates that culture. So to start to address that, the leadership has to stop doing that, and leadership has to demonstrate that they're allowing that pervasive culture or that more open culture to appear. One way I've seen that work really well is by management and leadership walking around the floor, talking to people, being engaged, being visible, being part of the team instead of the leadership element that's divorced and separate from it. So they're immersed in the culture and they can sense it more and more. Another way to tell your culture and identify how you might try and address it is to have some trusted sources in various levels of the organisation, in various roles, who know they can come to you and say, hey, we've got a problem here and these things are happening. Very, very complex problem to challenge, because while we talk about the culture of the organisation, any hospital or any organisation will have multiple microcultures. Let me call them microcultures within. So the culture of the nursing staff, the medical staff, the orthopaedic surgeon, the general surgeon, that's all part of the culture. But the leadership defines the culture of the organisation. And I think the leadership, by becoming immersed in the organisation instead of just sitting on top of it, helps make sure the culture is open and amenable to being a more safety and quality-driven organisation.
So as a senior medical leader, how do you go about developing a culture of accountability? We've read in the scenario that when individuals change roles, the recommendations just disappear. How do you, as a senior clinical leader, develop accountability in your organisation?
I think the answer there is to set up the system so that it's independent of whether the person hands over the problem, and it's entrained in thought and entrained in practice. It is an interesting observation that often good ideas don't last longer than the person who had the idea, and they don't sustain. One of the issues when you come up with a recommendation from an audit is to make sure it's sustainable and to test that it works. But I think likewise, from a leadership perspective, what I've got to do is make sure people realise we want these to be sustainable. We need to have that culture of having, I'll say, progress boards, for want of a better way to put it, of recommendations, showing people I'm interested in recommendations, not just signing off on them and saying, yep, that's great, but then going back and saying how are they implemented, testing that they've been implemented and they're working, and ensuring people understand that it's not just a case of doing the audit and saying, here are the recommendations. It's then following through on the recommendations.
How do you move away from a sort of a focus on the process and the machinery of delivery and move to focus on the patient and the harm that is created or could be avoided?
I think the simple answer in my mind is you stop auditing the process. So you start looking at what audits you're doing and saying, hang on, let's get together and think about what are the outcomes we want to look at. As you say, thinking about the patient, let's start involving the patient in terms of how they think we should measure our services. We can look at the technical aspects, but we need to look at those things like the patient-reported outcome measures and the patient-reported experience measures are good starts, but also the outcome in terms of follow-up of patients over time to see that we've actually done them some good. It's sort of like doing the right thing at the time or doing things right or doing the right thing. So you may well do things quite right and your process might be fine, but if it's not producing a good outcome, you're not doing the right things. So they're not easy audits and they're not easy things to measure, but if you continue to just look at processes because you couldn't be bothered to develop an outcome audit or an outcome measure, then you're going to be stuck in that rut. And the people who can help you are your clinicians, and your patients, because they can tell you what matters in terms of outcomes much more than your process audits will.
Audits are critical. They often identify issues before they occur. How do you rationalise the number of audits that your organisation's doing? It's not unusual to see a hospital that'll have 6 or 8 staff dedicated to audits all day, every day, taking up significant time of the nurses on the floor's efforts and just responding to audits. How do you make audits rational and reasonable?
I thought you were going to say, how do you make audits fun?
Well, yes.
Look, I think that's where that first step in deciding what to audit is important. And I'm just talking about clinical audits. There are lots of audits that the Audit and Risk Committee will have to do from a corporate governance perspective, and you'd like to make sure you deconflict them so you're not putting too much pressure on your staff time-wise. But in terms of the clinical audits, I think that's where the things I try and do is make sure that the audit can actually be done from normal business. So it doesn't need to be a specific thing. Much easier these days with electronic records, of course. But if you don't need people to stop and do something to fill in the audit and do the data collection, and you have a system to analyse the data, then your streets ahead because you're not taking them away from their day job. The other thing is to make sure that your audit programs are coordinated. So if you find it's a bit like surveys of hospitals, if you let everyone do a survey whenever they want, then your staff are going to be fatigued from survey. It's like audits. If people want to do an audit, there needs to be a governance process over what audits are happening so that it can be controlled, it can be make sure we're doing the things that matter and that we understand the impact on the staff on the floor when we're commissioning these audits.
One of the challenges with audits is the results can often be reported back to frontline staff weeks or months after the audit was undertaken. Adult learning suggests that you need feedback immediately. How do you ensure that the staff who are audited understand the results in a way that they can change their practice?
I like to actually feed the results back to the staff when I get them and have them heavily involved in identifying issues and potential causes, potential solutions. So I think rather than an audit report where you do the audit, you go away and write up a 300-word tome or 300-page tome about what you did and how you did it and what you found and the analysis. You do the audit, you find the data, and rather than you interpret it, you go back and help get your staff to help you interpret it and to make sure you understand it. You may well have done what you think is a very good audit, but the staff will tell you, well, they're not the things that matter. You've missed crucial bits and, you don't understand that that's dependent on these 2 steps. And if those 2 steps aren't there, then this outcome's not going to work. So I think to try and make sure the staff, and it helps them be engaged in the audit as well in the process. But I think the answer to getting that feedback to them is to make them part of the process. Don't make it a separate process. And importantly, ask them to be part of the solution setting. They're going to have to implement something. So to make them part of that process, I think is much better than just giving them a paper some weeks later that they've forgotten what the audit was about anyway and haven't had any input into it. It's almost a little bit like due process, isn't it, where you're going to find something, you give someone a chance to respond to it before you find and give them a chance to comment on it.
Yeah, IV line audit labelling is one that we struggled with. Getting the nurse unit manager to actually check during her daily rounds and talk to the nurses where it's not compliant, we found was much more effective than having reports come back 3 or 4 weeks later saying you're 80% compliant in your IV line labelling processes.
That's right, yeah.
Medical staff are notoriously difficult to engage in audits. Can you talk to us about how you get medical staff involved in audits and how you can change their behaviour?
I almost contend or almost disagree with your statement that medical staff aren't interested in audits. They're not interested in the routine audits we might do, but I actually find a surprising number of them actually are interested in audits. Now, they may audit their own work and they may keep records of their own work. So I think the answer to the question is to get them involved in working out what they want audited. So don't just impose audits on people. There's a limit here and there's a line where you might have to impose something. But by and large, you want to try and ask them to give input in what they want audited. And once again, to try and make them part of the audit team so that the audit results are important to them as well as they are important to you.
So when you get an audit report in, you've got the current status report. What other things are you looking for to see whether or not the audit is appropriate and effective?
I'm looking for how it was done and who did it, looking for sources of bias. In particular, while it's not a research project, it's still very easy for people to select cases to audit, put them in a good light. So looking for sources of bias and selection bias in the audit sample. Make sure it was an adequate audit. And that's based on the quantity of events that you want audited to see if you've got a good proportion of them. And getting a feel for, has the audit actually had a question to address and has it addressed that question? So often I find audits start with a question and end up answering something else because they've been sidetracked. Or more likely had a very vague start that they said we want to audit X without necessarily pinning down what X really was. And so their data collection has been random or diverse. They really haven't got the right data to answer their audit question. And so they've sort of come up with almost post hoc analysis of data and not related to the audit question that they thought they were answering.
So with so many audits, they come in every 3 months or 6 months, they're exactly the same and they've been the same for the last 5 years. What concerns does that raise?
The concern is complacency. I guess you could argue, how can you continuously improve if you're already really good? There's always room for improvement. There's always things that you need to find. And so I think if someone's audit results are so stable, then I'd be worried that people aren't really applying the audit properly. They're not approaching it very well, or there's a high degree of complacency. I find that actually when people are doing self-audits. So if you send out an audit tool for people to fill in and it all comes back looking rosy, they're the ones that worry me because it may well be, but you're just concerned that they haven't actually put their mind to the audit and been engaged in it. But my biggest answer to that issue over 5 years or so is complacency.
So many of our audits seem to be undertaken for accreditation purposes. They're compliance, they're tick box, yes, here's our file, we audit it all the time. What's the purpose of audits?
Well, there are compliance audits and they've got a part to play. That's, I guess, where auditing started to a degree. My interest and my interest from a clinical governance perspective is in what I call clinical audits and clinical quality audits. And they're designed not to answer a compliance question, compliant yes or no, but what are the areas for improvement or what can we do to do better? And so the purpose of audits, in my perspective, primarily should be to drive improvement processes. If it's just to give you a tick in the box, and I take that accreditation bodies need to get a tick in the box, but if you're really looking for sustained improvement in your health system, then your audits have to be designed to drive that by looking at clinical quality issues, not just compliance issues. And the real trick in that is to say the answer of the audit is not we're compliant, yes or no, but here's what we can do to improve.
Let's go back to the scenario again. What does a high-functioning organisation look like in the way it conducts its audits, reports its audits and implements recommendations?
Wow, I'm almost tempted to say if I see one, I'll let you know. I think the answer to that is that the audit process is accepted by people. It's encouraged and supported. It's not avoided. It's not seen to be a train around the neck. People understand why they're doing the audit and hence actively participate in the audit. The results and the process of the audit are routine business. So it's not as if, we're now doing this audit, it's this time of the year. It's let's go and do the audit this week. And the results likewise permeate through management meetings, clinical governance meetings, executive meetings with acceptance of recommendations. And so I think that's the difference, that the high-performing organisations, it's just routine to do an audit and routine to have some improvement after it, and you get on and do the next one, as opposed to it's a big thing, we've got to stop everything and do the audit to comply with someone's requirement to do an audit. So I think that's the way I describe a high-functioning unit that is high-functioning from an audit perspective.
As you commented earlier, it's about leadership, and part of leadership is celebration. And so I found high-functioning organisations use audit to demonstrate how good they are rather than focusing on the deficits.
Yep. And I think that's part of that process where it's inculcated in the executive and the management meetings where the audit results are discussed and openly commented on, good, bad or indifferent, accepting that, there's an acceptance that we might need to improve, but there's also an acceptance that, okay, we've audited that and we're doing okay. What do we do next? So yes, I agree that reward component of it is part of that, having it in terms of daily practice or routine management processes.
Looking at the auditors and their findings, they can often come up with recommendations that are impractical. How do you make sure that the organisation comes up with changes that can in fact be implemented?
As an auditor, what I like to do is make sure I run my recommendations past the area that it pertains to before I make them. So to try and avoid that very trap, it's easy to come in from afar and think you can change the world and fix things. So it is useful as an auditor to go back to the people who you've audited and say, okay, here's what I've found, what are your possible solutions, and have them once again involved in the solutions. So I think that's part of it. The other thing, depending on who's done the audit, from a management perspective and a clinical governance perspective, is to see if you agree with the recommendations. Sometimes they may not be, as you say, they may be not implementable, and it may be that you've got to go back to someone and say, no, look, I'm sorry, here's why I can't do that, but we'll do X, Y, Z. So I'm more than happy to agree that if the recommendations aren't implementable, then they can't be, but you then work with the team to see what can be done to address whatever was found.
One of the challenges in clinical governance is getting integration between the quality improvement team, the audit team, the risk management team, the patient complaints, patient feedback teams. How do you make sure that audits become part of the organisation-wide quality improvement program rather than standing on their own?
Primarily by making sure that all those activities have what I'll call a common governance structures or overlapping governance structures. So if any of those programs are operating in isolation and without some cross-pollination and understanding of what each one's doing, then it's going to look like they're silos and not working very well. Depending on the structure of the health service, it may well be that they're all have a board subcommittee that's part of it. And then the composition of that subcommittee should include some common people across the different committees so that someone who's on the patient safety subcommittee can talk to the audit committee and say, hang on, the patient safety committee have seen that. Why haven't you guys done X, Y? Why don't the audit team do this, that and the other? So ideally the integration can happen at the floor level, but otherwise it's got to happen up the chain. And it's really by making sure that the governance structures of the organisation are not siloed and that there's good integration of those through appropriate membership of committees, appropriate representation at forum, and appropriate crossover of findings and crossover of information. So I think they're the ways you've got to try and work on building the integration. Some of it's personal, some of it depends on personalities, but most of it can be driven by making sure that they're not allowed to operate in isolation and they've got to share their information with others and be part of broader arrangements as well.
That was Brigadier Dr Darrell Duncan speaking about the complex issues of hospital audits and what to do when they are failing to result in improved practice. That brings us to the end of this episode of Safeguarding Healthcare. Follow Safeguarding Healthcare free on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. This podcast is produced by Sound Cartel for the Royal Australasian College of Medical Administrators.